One of the most misunderstood aspects of power is that it does not always look like constant visibility. We live in a culture that teaches us the opposite. We are told to be present, to be available, to respond immediately, to constantly show what we are doing, what we are achieving, where we are going. Social media has intensified this instinct. People announce their plans before they have accomplished them. They reveal their emotions before they understand them. They explain their decisions before anyone has even asked. But there is another way to operate. The most strategically minded people understand that constant visibility has a hidden cost. It makes you predictable. When people know exactly where you are, what you think, what you want, how you feel, and what you are going to do next, they no longer have to wonder about you. They simply react to a pattern they already understand, and once people understand your pattern, they can begin to anticipate you, influence you, and sometimes control you. This is why powerful people sometimes disappear. Their disappearance is not necessarily a sign of weakness. In many cases, it is a form of psychological distance. They are creating space between themselves and the expectations of others. They are refusing to allow every person around them to have unlimited access to their attention. Think about what happens when someone is constantly available. You message them and they answer immediately. You ask for something and they rush to provide it. You demand an explanation and they give you one. You criticize them and they defend themselves. You become angry and they become anxious. Eventually, without realizing it, they have trained everyone around them to believe that their attention is always available. And anything that is always available eventually becomes taken for granted. This is one of the basic psychological principles of human behavior. We tend to value what requires effort to obtain. Scarcity changes perception, distance changes perception, absence changes perception. This does not mean you should become arrogant, cold, or deliberately ignore people. That is a shallow interpretation of the principle. The deeper lesson is about control over your own availability. You must be able to decide when your presence has value and when your absence has greater value. Imagine a person who enters every conversation with an opinion. They comment on everything. They respond to every insult. They explain every decision. They try to correct every misunderstanding. At first, people may see this as confidence, but eventually they recognize something else. This person cannot tolerate being misunderstood. That is a vulnerability. If someone can provoke you simply by saying something inaccurate about you, they have discovered a lever. If they know that criticism will immediately make you defend yourself, they can use criticism to control your attention. The powerful person learns something different. Not every accusation deserves a response. Not every misunderstanding requires correction. Not every invitation deserves acceptance. Not every conflict deserves your energy. Sometimes the strongest response is to step away. This is where disappearance becomes psychologically significant. When you withdraw from unnecessary noise, you regain something extremely valuable: perspective. When you are constantly surrounded by opinions, demands, expectations, and emotional reactions, it becomes difficult to hear your own judgment. You begin making decisions based on what other people expect from you, rather than what you actually believe is necessary. Distance interrupts this process. You step away from the crowd, and suddenly you can see the crowd. You notice who only contacts you when they need something. You notice who becomes uncomfortable when you stop entertaining them. You notice who respects your boundaries and who tries to punish you for having them. You notice which relationships are built on genuine connection and which are built on convenience. And this is one reason powerful people disappear before making major decisions. They need silence. History is filled with examples of people who withdrew from public attention while they prepared their next move. They understood that announcing every intention gives others the opportunity to interfere. The moment you reveal a plan, you invite opinions. The moment you invite opinions, you create pressure, and the more pressure you experience, the more tempted you become to adjust your strategy simply to satisfy other people. Silence protects unfinished ideas. When you are building something important, you do not always need an audience. In fact, an audience can become a distraction. People may mock the idea before they understand it. They may tell you why it will fail because they cannot imagine it themselves. They may become jealous. They may attempt to redirect you towards something that makes them comfortable. So sometimes you need to disappear, not because you are afraid of judgment, but because you are protecting your concentration. There is another psychological effect that makes strategic absence powerful. People begin filling the silence with their own imagination. When you are always explaining yourself, people receive information directly from you. But when you become quiet, they begin interpreting your behavior. What is he doing? Why has she stopped responding? What changed? Is something happening? Did they discover something? Are they preparing something? Notice what happens here. Your absence creates mental activity in other people. And this is far more powerful than constantly demanding attention. A person who constantly says, "Look at me," eventually becomes background noise. But a person who suddenly becomes quiet after years of visibility can create enormous curiosity. Again, the lesson is not manipulation. The lesson is understanding human psychology. Attention is a resource. Your time is a resource. Your emotional energy is a resource. Your presence is a resource. If you give these things away indiscriminately, you reduce their value, not because you are less valuable, but because you have failed to establish boundaries around something valuable. Think about your own life. How often have you answered a message when you were exhausted simply because you felt obligated? How often have you explained yourself to someone who had already decided to misunderstand you? How often have you remained in a conversation long after it stopped being productive because you were afraid that leaving would make you look weak? These moments reveal something important. Sometimes we remain visible because we are afraid of becoming irrelevant. We fear that if we stop talking, people will forget us. If we stop showing up, people will replace us. If we stop explaining ourselves, people will misunderstand us. But constantly proving your relevance can actually make you appear less secure. A person who knows their value does not need to constantly advertise it. There is tremendous strength in being able to leave a room without demanding that everyone understand why you left. There is strength in stepping back from an argument without needing the final word. There is strength in spending time alone without interpreting solitude as rejection. Because the moment you become comfortable with your own absence, you become less dependent on the approval of others. And that is where real psychological independence begins. Power is not simply the ability to make other people obey you. At a deeper level, power is the ability to govern yourself, to control your impulses, to control your reactions, to control your availability, to decide where your attention goes instead of allowing everyone else to decide for you. The person who cannot disappear is often the person who cannot detach. They need constant reassurance, constant interaction, constant recognition. The person who can step away, think, observe, rebuild, and return with greater clarity has developed something far more valuable than popularity. They have developed autonomy. So if you feel that you must always be visible, always respond, always explain, always prove yourself, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, what would happen if I stopped trying to be understood by everyone? Maybe nothing would happen. Maybe the people who truly value you would remain. Maybe the people who only valued your availability would disappear. And perhaps that would reveal something you needed to know all along. You do not become powerful by making yourself constantly visible. You become powerful when you are no longer afraid of being unseen. There comes a moment in the life of almost every ambitious person when they discover a difficult truth. Not every environment deserves their presence. You can be talented, disciplined, intelligent, and deeply committed to your goals, yet remain stuck because you are operating inside a system that continuously consumes your energy without giving you anything valuable in return. This is where powerful people behave differently. They learn to recognize when an environment has stopped serving their strategy. They do not necessarily announce their departure. They do not always create dramatic confrontations. Often, they simply become less available. They stop participating in unnecessary conflicts. They reduce their exposure. They quietly redirect their attention towards something more productive. From the outside, it can look like disappearance. But internally, it may be a calculated retreat. Most people have been conditioned to believe that leaving is a sign of weakness. If someone challenges you, you are expected to fight. If someone rejects you, you are expected to prove yourself. If an organization undervalues you, you are encouraged to work harder until they finally recognize your worth. But this mentality can become a trap. There is a difference between perseverance and attachment. Perseverance means continuing because the objective is still worth pursuing. Attachment means continuing because you are emotionally invested in proving that you were right to stay. Those two things may look identical from the outside, but psychologically they are completely different. A powerful person learns to ask a question that most people avoid. Is my continued presence actually increasing my power, or am I simply afraid to leave? That question can change your life. Because sometimes the greatest mistake is not quitting too early. Sometimes it is staying too long. You remain in a friendship that constantly diminishes you because you remember how good it used to be. You remain in a professional environment that has stopped offering growth because you are afraid of starting again. You remain in a social circle that rewards conformity because you are uncomfortable with the possibility of becoming isolated. And slowly, without noticing it, you begin adapting yourself to an environment that is no longer compatible with the person you are becoming. This is one of the hidden dangers of familiarity. We confuse what is familiar with what is beneficial. Just because you have been somewhere for 5 years does not mean you should remain there for another 5. Just because you have known someone for 10 years does not mean the relationship is still healthy for your development. Time invested does not automatically justify future investment. This is difficult for human beings to accept because we hate the idea that our previous sacrifices might have been wasted. We think, I have already spent so much time here, but the time is already gone. The real question is not how much you have invested. The question is what the next year of your life will produce if you continue. This is where strategic thinking separates itself from emotional thinking. The emotional mind asks, how can I preserve what I already have? The strategic mind asks, what position gives me the greatest advantage from this point forward? Powerful people think in terms of position. They examine the people around them. They study incentives. They look at opportunities. They evaluate whether the environment rewards competence or mediocrity. They notice whether their relationships are based on mutual respect or dependency, and when the equation changes, they change with it. This is not betrayal, it is adaptation. Nature itself teaches this principle. Survival belongs to organisms capable of responding to changing environments. Human beings are no different. If the conditions around you change, your strategy must change as well. The problem is that many people become emotionally attached to an old version of themselves. They say, "This is who I am," but perhaps the person you were 5 years ago needed that environment. Perhaps you needed that relationship, perhaps you needed that job, perhaps you needed that social circle. But growth changes your requirements. What once felt comfortable can eventually become restrictive. And when that happens, powerful people recognize the signal. They do not necessarily destroy the old environment. They simply stop depending on it. This distinction is important. There is a kind of immature power that needs to defeat everyone before leaving. It needs revenge. It needs recognition. It needs people to understand that they were wrong. But mature power does not require this. If an environment is no longer useful, you do not have to burn it down. You can simply move. That is often the more powerful move. Because revenge keeps you psychologically connected to the people you claim to have outgrown. If you spend months thinking about how to punish someone who disrespected you, that person still occupies your mind. If you spend months trying to prove your former colleagues wrong, they still control your attention. If you leave physically but remain emotionally obsessed, you have not truly left. Real departure happens when your attention moves elsewhere. This is why powerful people sometimes disappear without explanation. They have already made peace with the decision. They understand that not everyone deserves an explanation for every transition in your life. There is a stage in personal development where you stop asking, "Will they understand?" and you start asking, "Does this decision move me forward?" That shift is enormous because people will often resist your growth, not necessarily because they are evil, but because your transformation disrupts the version of you that they became comfortable with. If you suddenly become more disciplined, they may call you distant. If you establish boundaries, they may call you selfish. If you stop participating in gossip, they may call you arrogant. If you leave an environment that constantly distracts you, they may accuse you of thinking you are better than everyone else. You cannot build your life around preventing other people's interpretations. At some point, you must accept that being misunderstood is sometimes the price of changing direction. And this is where strategic disappearance becomes powerful. You stop arguing about your future and start building it. You stop announcing what you are going to do and begin doing it. You stop trying to convince everyone that you are capable and allow your results to speak later. There is enormous psychological freedom in this. You do not need permission to change your environment. You do not need unanimous approval to pursue a different path. You do not need to remain accessible to people simply because they once had access to you. But there is also a warning here. Do not confuse strategic retreat with avoidance. Powerful people do not disappear simply because something is difficult. They disappear when they recognize that the difficulty is no longer producing meaningful growth. There are battles worth fighting. There are uncomfortable seasons that must be endured. There are moments when leaving would simply be an escape from necessary development. The key is discernment. Ask yourself, am I leaving because this environment is genuinely limiting me, or because I am uncomfortable being challenged? That distinction requires brutal honesty. If you leave every time someone criticizes you, you will never develop resilience. If you leave every time something becomes difficult, you will never master anything. But if you stay simply because you are afraid of starting over, you may spend years defending a position that no longer serves you. The mature individual learns to distinguish between temporary discomfort and permanent misalignment. Sometimes you need patience, sometimes you need courage, and sometimes you simply need to walk away. When you develop the ability to leave strategically, something changes inside you. You stop feeling trapped. You realize that your environment is not your identity. A job is not your identity. A social group is not your identity. A relationship is not your identity. Even a failure is not your identity. You are capable of changing position, and the person who knows they can leave is much harder to control, because dependence creates vulnerability. If you believe you have nowhere else to go, you will tolerate almost anything. But when you know that you can rebuild, relocate, start again, learn again, and walk alone if necessary, your decisions become clearer. You stop negotiating against yourself. You stop accepting disrespect simply because you fear losing access. You stop confusing endurance with strength, and perhaps that is the deeper reason powerful people sometimes disappear. They have learned that their future is more important than their attachment to the past. They are willing to leave the familiar in order to protect the possible. So look carefully at your own environment. Ask yourself what it is producing in you. Are you becoming stronger, wiser, more disciplined, and more capable? Or are you becoming anxious, distracted, resentful, and smaller? The answer may tell you whether you need to fight harder or whether it is time to move. There is a strange psychological force that most people underestimate: unpredictability. We are naturally drawn to patterns. We study people because patterns allow us to anticipate what they will do. We learn who becomes angry when challenged, who immediately apologizes, who always answers the phone, who cannot tolerate silence, who needs constant approval. Over time, we build a mental map of the people around us, and once someone becomes predictable, they become easier to influence. This is why powerful people sometimes disappear without warning. Not because they want to create unnecessary drama, and not because they are trying to manipulate everyone around them, but because they understand the value of controlling access to themselves. If everyone knows exactly where you are, what you are thinking, what you are planning, and how you will respond to pressure, you surrender a certain psychological advantage. You become readable, and being readable is not always weakness, but being completely predictable can make you vulnerable. Consider someone who always responds to disrespect. Someone insults them, and immediately they defend themselves. Someone questions their ability, and they begin explaining. Someone threatens to leave, and they panic. Someone withdraws affection, and they chase. Their reactions become a script. Eventually, other people do not even need to think deeply about how to influence them. They simply press the familiar buttons. The powerful individual tries to break that pattern. They learn to pause. They learn to observe before responding. They learn that silence can be more informative than an emotional reaction. This is not about becoming cold. It is about becoming difficult to provoke. There is enormous strength in the ability to experience an emotional reaction without immediately expressing it. You can feel anger without displaying anger. You can feel fear without allowing fear to dictate your next move. You can feel insulted without immediately demanding an apology. That small space between stimulus and response is where self-control develops. And self-control is one of the foundations of real power. Most people think power means controlling external circumstances. But the deeper form of power begins with controlling yourself. If another person's words can instantly determine your emotional state, then they possess influence over you. If another person's approval determines your confidence, they possess influence over you. If another person's rejection determines your sense of worth, they possess influence over you. The person who becomes psychologically independent begins removing these external controls. This is why disappearance can be so powerful. When you stop reacting, people lose information. They no longer know exactly what affects you. They may wonder what you are thinking. They may wonder whether you are angry, indifferent, focused, or simply moving in another direction. And uncertainty creates psychological tension. But understand something important. You should never become unpredictable merely for the sake of confusing people. That becomes childish. Real strategic unpredictability comes from having enough internal freedom that you are not forced to follow the same behavioral pattern every time. You can respond, you can remain silent, you can leave, you can negotiate, you can change direction. You can wait, you can say no. The point is not that people never know what you will do. The point is that you are not trapped into doing what they expect you to do. This distinction separates genuine strength from theatrical behavior. A person who constantly tries to appear mysterious is often desperate to be perceived as powerful. A genuinely self-controlled person does not need to appear mysterious. They simply do not reveal everything. There is wisdom in keeping certain plans private. There is wisdom in allowing an idea to develop before exposing it to criticism. There is wisdom in refusing to announce every change in your life. The moment you reveal a plan to everyone, you create a social expectation around it. Now you have something to prove. People begin asking, "How is it going?" They begin offering opinions. Some become skeptical, others become competitive. Some may even subtly discourage you because your growth threatens their perception of themselves. And suddenly, instead of pursuing your objective, you are managing everyone else's reactions to your objective. This is why silence can protect ambition. Work quietly, build quietly, learn quietly, improve quietly. Then allow the result to become the announcement. There is another reason powerful people become less predictable. They understand that constant availability creates entitlement. If someone knows that you will always answer, they begin expecting answers. If they know you will always forgive, they may stop respecting your boundaries. If they know you will always return after being rejected, they may assume they can treat you carelessly without consequences. Your behavior teaches people how to interact with you. This does not mean you should punish people through silence. It means your boundaries must have consequences. If someone repeatedly violates your standards, you do not necessarily need to deliver a dramatic speech. You can reduce access. You can step away, you can stop participating, you can redirect your attention. Sometimes the clearest boundary is behavioral rather than verbal, and this brings us back to the mysterious disappearance of powerful people. Often, their disappearance is not about making others afraid, it is about making themselves free. They are no longer addicted to being seen. They no longer need to win every conversation. They no longer need to know what everyone thinks of them. They understand that attention is temporary and reputation is unstable, so instead of constantly managing perception, they focus on substance. This is a profound psychological transition. Early in life, many people ask, "How do I look to others?" As they mature, they begin asking, "What am I actually becoming?" Those questions lead to completely different lives. The first produces performance, the second produces development. And sometimes development requires disappearing from the social theater. You step away from the noise. You stop explaining, you stop announcing, you stop reacting. You spend time studying your weaknesses, strengthening your skills, and understanding your environment. From the outside, people may think nothing is happening, but internally, everything is changing. This is why you should never assume that someone's absence means they have become irrelevant. Sometimes absence is preparation. Sometimes silence is strategy. Sometimes withdrawal is reconstruction. The seed disappears beneath the soil before anyone sees the tree, and there is a lesson here that extends beyond power. You do not need everyone to understand your next move. You do not need to reveal every intention. You do not need to respond to every provocation. You do not need to make your entire life publicly available for inspection. Protect some parts of yourself. Protect your plans until they are strong enough to withstand criticism. Protect your attention from people who constantly demand it. Protect your emotional stability from people who enjoy provoking you. Protect your future from the need to impress people who may not even be part of it. But there is one final principle to remember. Unpredictability without purpose becomes chaos. Silence without discipline becomes avoidance. Disappearance without growth becomes isolation. The goal is not simply to vanish. The goal is to return stronger. That is the difference between running away and strategically withdrawing. When you disappear, use the distance to become more capable. Read, think, train, build, reflect, develop. Then when you return, let your transformation speak for you. Because the ultimate form of unpredictability is not that people cannot guess your next move. It is that you have become someone who is no longer controlled by the expectations that once defined you. You are no longer desperate to prove yourself. You are no longer addicted to attention. You are no longer dependent on immediate approval. You can enter a room without needing to dominate it. You can leave a room without needing to announce your departure. And you can walk away from people without losing yourself. That is freedom. So the next time someone questions why you have become quieter, less available, or more selective, do not rush to defend yourself. Ask yourself a deeper question. Am I becoming less visible because I am afraid, or because I am becoming more intentional? If it is fear, confront it. If it is strategy, embrace it, because the strongest person in the room is not always the loudest. Sometimes it is the person who has mastered the ability to remain silent. Observe everything, reveal little, and move only when the moment is right.